Hello and welcome to the Bonsai Stuff podcast. Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. I love you all. Thank you very much for listening in. I want to have a chat in this episode of the podcast about some practical advice for styling your pines. It's that time of the year where almost every single pine in your collection gets worked on, gets thoroughly worked on, gets cleaned out, thinned out, needle plucked, wire removed, wire reapplied, made look just beautiful. It's that time, pine time. So I'm sorry if you don't have any pines in your collection, but there's some practical advice for pad building, structure building, and some tips and tricks about shaping as well that are going to get talked about that apply to all your trees. But more so than not, I want to talk predominantly about pines in this episode. Of course, it'll apply to other conifers as well, but pines are what's flying through the workshop at the moment, seeing lots of different trees, and it's that thing about knowing what to do and having confidence to do it. And it might have been 12 months since you've been in there and needle plucked. It might have been 12 months since you've gone in and bud selected. So this is just a refresher to sort of help you get through that initial hurdle, that hesitation that you may have, saying, I just don't remember, it's been a while. So I thought if I just talk about it in the podcast, reassure you and get you going, well then it can certainly help. But it's one of my favourite topics, pines. Anyone that knows me knows that I love my pines. I love all species, to be honest, but pines really hold a very very special place in my heart. They always make me think of the pinnacle of my bonsai when I look at them. You know, when I get them beautiful at this time of the year, I really admire them. And then, you know, pines only get worked on a couple of times a year, plus repotting if it's repotting, but really it's only twice a year I get to spend time with them. So I make sure that when I'm doing this phase, this autumn winter work on them, that I don't rush it, that I don't push from tree to tree to tree. Just try and make sure they actually get to really spend some time with them and make some serious decisions and get them set up on a really good path for the next 12 months. So when I'm sitting down with them again this time next year, they're at a point where they've taken some big steps forward or just progressed the way that I'd like them to. I love referring back to my old photos, you know, from years and years ago and seeing how they've developed so quickly in such a short period of time and really become quite full. And they're very rewarding. They're a lovely tree. They are so well designed to be bonsai that last for a very long period of time. And that I strongly encourage you, if you don't have any, get some in your collection. But anyway, let's get into some practical advice on styling your pines at this time of the year. Now, before you start working on your trees, you'll look at them now. They've been through spring growth. Everything's taken off. They probably looked quite nice at the start of spring. Then spring growth's gone everywhere. You may have, done some candle breaking, whatever. Then you get through to the summer period. You may have done candle cutting or decandling, some kind of work on the trees at that point, and to hopefully create, extra buds or another flush of growth or whatever it is that you've done. And by now you're looking at them and they're a mess. The old needles have started rolling over and pushing down. Rather than sitting up nice and perky, they've started to round down. And there's nice new needles in there somewhere, but there might be old needles from last year. There might be areas that didn't get decandled or candle cut that might have long needles on them now, depending on the variety. And you might just be looking at them going, they just look not right. They don't look like the pine that I have in my mind or what they used to look like. So it's that whole, where do I start? What do I do? What am I going to do? Now, we're going to talk about lots of different things. We're going to talk about, cutting. We're going to talk about bud selection. We're going to talk about needle plucking. We're going to talk about wiring and styling and lots of different things in the podcast. So don't worry, we'll get there. We'll get there eventually. There's just so much to get your head around. I've tried to break it down into little bite-sized pieces so you get a focus as we work through your trees. Be very careful when you start going through and working on the tree, right, that you don't start to flatten the structure. If you look at it now, it looks full. the tree looks really nice and full. Be very careful and keep this as a primary point of focus when you're working with your tree. I don't want to flatten the structure. I don't want to take my pad that's all nice and volume now. There's lots of needles everywhere. Maybe that doesn't look very nice, but there's lots of needles everywhere. You don't want to have that so it flattens out to be a saucer. All right, so just keep that in the back of your mind as you're working your way through the tree. You want on your pads to build some height. When you look at a photo of a nice pine bonsai, or you see one in the flesh, you'll notice that the pads on the tree have volume, and the volume can come from the needle density, of course, because it's not like a deciduous where there's only sort of one little leaf or two leaves at the end of the branch. There's a bunch of needles at the end, which gives you volume. It fills out the tree, right? So it fills out the pad. But you've got to have that depth of pad, or the volume in the pad, built by other branches that come in and sit over the top of the base branches. So you'll have inside a pad, you'll have layers of branching structure. So when you're working your way back through and you're cutting and you're plucking and you're sorting things out, just keep in the back of your mind that I want to have pad volume, right? So the bud conveyor is obviously really important because it's those buds back in further in closer to the trunk that are going to push out and give you, replacement branches. But it's also those buds that are back in further and those little branches that are in further that can be kept and chosen to give you pad volume. They can layer up on top of your base pad to give you that extra oomph, that pillow effect, that doming effect inside your pad. So when you're going through and pruning and selecting buds, make sure that you're keeping in the back of your mind that, hey, I need some height with this pad. When you get to the point where you are cutting and pruning things out, that old saying of anything growing up, cut it off, don't do that. Definitely don't do that. If they're growing directly vertical, then they go because they get all the resources. But if they're on the angle, heading away from the trunk towards the tip of the branch, but they're pointing up, 25, 30, 45, 50 degrees, even say 60, 70 degrees, they're really nice branches to keep for volume. They give you that top layer of your pad. So if it's growing directly straight up, then chances are pretty likely that that'll be removed. If it's laying down a little bit towards the horizontal, perfect. They're the ones that we definitely want. They're the ones that we want to keep because it's going to give us that volume that we want. So when you're looking at organising your pads and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to wire this pad out, don't take all the tips of the foliage and lay them out side by side by side. It's a really common mistake. I used to do it myself, where I would wire the branches and I'd go, okay, one branch has got to divide into two, or I can run wire on those two branches, and then I'll put the tips at the very end of the pad. And I'll get along to the next sub branch. Oh yeah, there's another two. I'll wire those two, and I'll put them beside the first two. So you end up with all this vacant branch structure back in close to the trunk, and all the foliage is wrapped around the extremity of the pad, right furthest away from the tree. Now what you want to do is you want to take some of those shorter branches and layer them up and sit them on top of the first base layer of the pad. So you'll still have that tip of the pad, which is the furthest point from the trunk. But instead of having, I don't know, let's say it's 8 tips of foliage that you've got that are making up that tip, you might keep, say, 4 of them or 5, let's say, and do the base layer. Then the other 3 you'll organise to come back in and sit over the top of those base branches, and that's what's going to give you some additional volume on your pad. And it might be a short-term thing that you sort of not necessarily spaghetti and push them back, but you want those branches to come in and sit a little bit closer to the trunk and a little bit higher than what the base branches are for that pad. And that's going to give you that volume that you want. But be selective about your bud retention. Okay, so as you're working your way through, I know that I talk about 1 to 2, and I'm going to come back to this later on. One branch divides into 2, and with pines it's especially true. But just be really selective about which ones you're keeping. Like, The angle of the branch is nice. We can wire them, we can push them back in to give you that higher raised branch back further in towards the trunk to give you that volume. But you can also be selective about which ones you choose based on its position on the branch from the trunk. Those inner buds are fantastic. They're great. But often I'll find that they're kept incorrectly. They might be at a junction of a branch. They might be underneath a branch. They might be growing the wrong way. I know it's backbudding that we want with our pines, but make sure that it's working with the flow of the branch away from the trunk itself. So just be selective about it. The other thing that it's so common with almost every single tree that I work on, but especially pines at this time of the year, the foliage starts to grow too far away from the tree. Now, if you can visualize whatever tree it is that you're working on at the moment, this doesn't matter which species it is, but I'm talking about pines for this podcast, but any tree, if you can sit back, look at that bonsai in front of you and go, what is the perfect width of foliage on this tree? Ignoring where it's at now, but what's the perfect width of foliage on that tree based on the trunk thickness, based on everything about the design? What would you ideally want that foliage to be? And I'd guarantee that foliage is going to be in closer than where it is currently on your tree. I was working on one the other day where it was a really old tree. It had got a bit run down. Its health wasn't quite as good. So time was spent rebuilding the strength of the tree and really getting things turned around rather than focusing on styling the tree for about a year, 2 years, something like that. And perfect. That is the ultimate, right? To build the strength of the tree, build the health of the tree, repot it, get it in good soil, feed it up, get sun on it, get it growing really nicely, and you can see that switch get flicked from being in a poor state to a really healthy state because of the needles. So last year's needles, twisted, long, thin, flimsy, not feeling really good. Last year, the spring's needles that have come through, strong, healthy, straight, nicely bunched, beautiful colour, all working in the same direction. Fantastic. The tree's turned the corner. It's showing you that it's done that. So once you've got that tick box done to say, okay, yep, health of the tree is not an issue anymore, I can move forward, then you start looking at the foliage on the tree and going, now it's sticking out way too far. This thing's been managed in a manner, I was going to say incorrectly managed, but it's just been managed in a different way to what I would do, where I always look at the trees and think, okay, I've got to push this foliage in. I've got to keep this stuff in nice and close. I've got to get that bud conveyor going. I've got to make sure that my tree is compact. I don't want it to be broad and wide. I want it to be nice and compact. So to do that, you've got to be really selective about which growth you're cutting off. And it could be, as was the situation with this tree, but it's a lot of pines that I work on. You go through and you're actually removing some pretty significant branches which are long and extended that have got the internode length, like from where the junction is on a branch until where the foliage appears, that distance there, if that's too long, especially on an old branch on a tree, on a pine tree, your chances of getting budding back in that area are nearly non-existent. And before you say, hey, you can graft in that area, yeah, you can. I choose not to. I choose not to graft on my pines. I've never really found it to be a long-term solution for me, given that graft is really not secured. An approach graft is really not secured, or a scion graft is really not secured quite as thoroughly as what I'd really like it to be. Thread grafting different, but I wouldn't do a scion graft with a pine. That's just my 2 cents. You may have great success with it and fantastic, awesome. But I would always look at those long extensions on branches and say, if it's not this year, it's going to be a year in the future where that has to get removed. I cannot live with a tree that's going to be too long, it's extended too far, and I'm not going to be looking at doing spaghetti wiring and pushing these branches back in and artificially twisting them just to keep that foliage. So I've got to have a point that I cut back to. And right now, you might look at it and go, well, yes, there is a branch coming off the side, but that's still too far away. My advice and my approach to it would be, all right, I'm still going to cut it back to that point and remove the furthest tip on that branch and come back to that first one. And then I'm going to really focus on the strength of the tree again and try and really push it that foliage is staying in closer. The bud conveyor starts to work, or there might be something further, in years to come where another bud can grow somewhere else that I can replace that entire branch with. And that's where that's where I think really nice compact bonsai come from making those really hard calls on old branches to say they're too long. It's got to get cut off. So I always look and say, okay, is there another branch coming off at any one point? There might be multiple branches coming off, and you might say, okay, for this year I'm just going to remove the very tip of the branch and start the pushback process. Fantastic. But ultimately, you've got to keep pushing it back further and further and further. As these trees the branches continue to get longer and longer and longer, you have to make those tough calls where you are constantly looking to push back. You don't want extending growth on these trees in the majority of cases. I'm trying to cover all scenarios here because you might have a tree where you want it, but for a nice compact bonsai, and especially a pine bonsai that you're working on at the moment, look at the branches, do that analysis, sit back, have a look at it and say, does this need to be pushed back? Is it broader than what ideally I would like? Almost invariably, yes, it is. All right, so where can you cut back to? And you work on any kind of tree, and even inside each individual pad that you're working on, there'll be certain areas that have got too long, that are too strong. So rather than just saying, yeah, okay, I've had one divide into two, that's perfect, I've got ramification, you want compact ramification. All right, so it needs, I'd say, as a priority, compaction above ramification always, 100%. So if I've got that division, but suddenly they've grown too long post, with black pines decandling, if they've grown too long, then unfortunately I've still got to go back and cut that entire branch off. So I'm removing those two buds that have started to grow. And yeah, sure, you're going, well, actually it's a step backwards. Why would I do that? Like, why wouldn't I look to wire these and shuffle them in and keep them? Because you're saying you want volume, but then you're cutting off foliage. Above everything else, for me, it's compaction. It's keeping the tree nice and in close. So I'm very selective when I'm choosing my buds. I'm not just saying, okay, 1 to 2 needle pluck towards the end, then why make it look as good as I possibly can and have these enormous pads that are sticking out that are very flat like saucers. It's like, no, I want compaction, I want volume. And if it means going back and saying, well, okay, the last 2 years' growth I've got to remove now because it's too long, so be it. I'll take that step backwards every day of the week, as opposed to having a branch which gets too long. I've got to make sure that the pushback is, the ideal size that I've decided for this tree, the width of the tree, the volume that I want. That is first and foremost. So I've got to keep things compact. I've got to look at what I can cut out, what I can remove. It's an easier way to look at it rather than saying, okay, I'm going to needle pluck, I'm going to bud select back to 2, I'm going to keep absolutely everything because I want the ramification. No, it's okay, how do I keep this thing nice and compact? Because compaction leads to good bonsai. So about this time of the year too, with your pines, in fact with a lot of trees, but with pines, you will start to see what I call the ski jump effect. Or it's bunching, but the ski jump effect really sticks in mind. So last year, you may well have wired your trees, got your branches looking beautiful, everything's wide right to the tips, looks fantastic, looks really nice. Then you got all this new growth, everything's started to push out and extend, it's got all bunched up, and the tips on the branches will be starting to scoop up. So it's the ski jump. It goes nice and, I assume, nice and downwards from the original wiring to getting towards a tip and then jumping up. So it's that whole ski jump effect. It's not a problem. It's common. And I just want to give you an insight as to how I manage that. Initially, what I'll do with the branches is I'll go through and I'll be plucking from the old needles coming forward, which I want to talk about plucking a little bit more, but I will then go through and I'll do this cutback, this pruning that I'm choosing to do, like remove the extension. I will also look to bud select, make sure that I'm keeping the ones that are in close and right direction and aiming for pad volume, naturally growing that way. Beautiful, perfect, great. Then it gets to the tips of the pad and it's like, well, now they're sticking up too far. I've got to do something about it. So wiring comes to mind. And wiring is really common with your pines. If you don't like wiring, I got told very early days, then pines probably aren't for you. And I enjoy wiring. It's a process, but it's therapeutic. It's very rewarding when you do it, when it's done well on your bonsai. So the ski jump effect, what I would encourage you to do is when you look at your branch structure, go back to the trunk. So ignore what you're going to be working on for now. Go back to the trunk and look at the primary branches. Now, are those primary branches all at the right angle as they exit from the trunk? Are they all consistent? Are they where you want them to be? And if they are, because you may have heavily wired those years ago, it could be 3, 4, 5 years ago that you set those branches in place, and you look at them and go, well, actually, the exit angle from the trunk is perfect, but it's just the tip. It's the tip that's ski jumping, but the actual exit angle of that branch is perfect. If that's the case, there is zero need to wire that branch entirely again. All right, I try and avoid at all costs putting wire around the trunk of a pine because one of the big features of a pine tree is the bark, which you'll know. So the more work that you're doing on it, the more manipulation, more wiring, more touching, more everything on that trunk, the more chance you've got of damaging the bark. So I will avoid it at every cost wherever I can. So rather than thinking, okay, I've got to wire the tips of the branches because they're starting to ski jump, don't think, okay, start back at the trunk and rewrap the wire all the way along because you've already done the hard work with the branches. They're already in the correct position. If they're not, ignore this part of the podcast because you've got to get the branches at the right angle. But if your branches are exiting the tree at the correct angle, then don't think about ever putting wire onto that part of the tree. What I do is I work my way out to the very tip of the branch, right? I look where the ski jump's occurring, and then I work my way back in to find the junction, the very first junction where that issue is occurring. Then you wire from that junction out towards the tip. So you join two branches together that are ski jumping. You start on top of the branches and you wire in a clockwise and an anti. So one wire clockwise, one wire anti-clockwise, going from the top of the junction around the branches towards the tip. And then you can bend just the tips down. And that way you're putting on far less wire on the trees. You're only really manipulating the very extension, the very tip of the branches, and you're pushing them down. You may find at that point when you start bringing the tips of the branches down too, that the pads may still be too wide. They may still be too big. You have to remove. If when you start pushing them down, they start to get too broad, too big, those pads, and the tree's silhouette starts to really pump out a little bit too far, then you're going to have to make a decision to look at cutting that back in. But my approach would be minimal wiring. If your trunk is set, if your primary branches are set, and really all you're doing is you're looking at the light ramification, the secondary branches, the tertiary branching structure, just wire that. Just do that as best you possibly can. And then once you've got all those little tips wide and they're starting to come down, if then you find that, hey, this branch is still sort of scooping up a little bit too much at the tip, I would then look to apply guy wires and loop it around some of the wire that you've done and look to pull it down to, the trunk line. Don't do it to the pot. I'd do it back to the tree. Maybe back to a branch junction where it's nice and secure back at the trunk itself. Protect it. Make sure your wire's not going to be cutting in. But set a guy wire from the tip of the branch down towards the backing on the trunk, and then tighten that up. And that way you can bring the whole branch down. And again, you've avoided doing anything serious with the trunk. You're not damaging any of the old bark on there, and it allows you to get your pad shape. Coming down, then out slightly and maybe up a little bit at the tip. Perfect. That's great. That's how we build the baseline structure of our pad. And then on top, we've got those other branches that we put on top that I talked about a bit earlier. It gives us our volume. And suddenly then we start to get a differential between one pad to the next as they structure and move their way up the tree. That bunching, that ski jump bunching effect, it's common. It happens all the time. And this is where the need to wire kicks in almost every year. You might find that you're not doing the overall, right back into the trunk, primary branch wiring, but there will be with your pines always something towards the tip that you need to do. There's only so much pruning that you can do that'll work. There's always going to be that tip that's going to want to push up. So it doesn't need to be super heavy wire, and so it's a lot easier. It's not that you're not using 6-7 mil wire to wire a trunk. You might be using 2.5 mil, something like that, just on the tips, just to bring them all down. You can go to 1.5 mil aluminium wire, if it's really light, but I'd find that 1.5 mil generally isn't strong enough to hold the tips, and the tree will start pulling it up somewhere in the future anyway when spring gets here. So I try and stick with 1.5 to 2.5 mil, something like that, as I'm wiring those branches, and bring them down. Make sure that they're needle plucked. I'm going to talk about needle plucking next, but make sure they're needle plucked correctly, and get them so you're layering. So you're lining them all up together. The tips on the buds are all facing the same way. If you've got two buds side by side, one's facing more vertical, one's facing further down towards the ground, the one that's facing up is going to get super strong and get all the resources. The one that's growing down is going to get weaker and have to push out and then start to curve up. So make sure when you sit back and look at them, look in at the pads from the extreme end of the pad, looking back, and make sure those buds are all pretty much facing the same direction, so they'll all get equal resources and start growing in the same direction when spring gets here. All right, needle plucking. Right, last bit of practical advice for working on your pines at the moment, and this applies to all of them. You're going to be needle plucking. You're going to be removing the vast majority of the old needles, not necessarily all the old needles, but you're going to remove the vast majority. Be careful. It's something that the technique for needle plucking is something that often leaves a few issues with the pine after you're finished. You want to pluck the needle in the direction they're growing. If you do that, you'll find you've got less chance of tearing at the base where the needles are attached to the branch than if you pluck against the grain. So, if it's growing out at a 45-degree angle, pluck it at a 45-degree angle and get your tweezers so they're basically in the same line as the needles. Don't grab the needle halfway, at perpendicular, like at right angles to the needle, and try and pluck it out. Have it so your tweezers are plucking and pointing in exactly the same direction as the needle. That way you'll find that as you're plucking, you're pulling in the direction that the needle's growing. They come out so much easier. If you find different varieties, let's say it's a white pine, a 5-needle pine, or it's maybe a Mugo pine or a Scots pine, and you're doing this clean out and whatever, as you're plucking, test it. Sometimes you'll pluck the needles and they'll come out easy. It's a piece of cake. It's like, no issue. I'm going to pluck away with tweezers, no problem. Other times you'll find that there's a resistance, like a real pull. Like you've got to really give it oomph to get it to pluck. Just double check that you're not actually tearing the needles off and leaving little indentations or damage to the branch that the tree's then going to have to heal. So you're tearing out any buds that are remaining dormant in that area, but you're also causing the tree to allocate resources to fix a mistake. If that's the case, one trick that I'll use is I'll pluck one needle at a time. So if it's a 2-needle pine, and grabbing one of the needles and plucking that often comes out a lot easier than trying to grab both the needles and pluck them at the same time. So you can do it quite quickly and just grab one, the next, bang, and they'll come out and you're at the same point. Other times you find that there's still great resistance there. Use your scissors. Get in and cut the needles down nice and low into the sheath, so you're only leaving a micro amount of needle there. Try not to leave too much needle. If you cut 3, 4, 5 mil above where the sheath is, a little white part holding the needle to the branch, you'll find that the needles may not fall off. But if you cut it short enough, those leftover stubs will go brown and just brush off the tree in a few weeks' time. So it's not really a problem. It doesn't really delay anything, doesn't look ugly. But using your scissors when there's greater resistance is a nice simple way. And I find that with the white pines, the more needles they've got, there's greater resistance. Sometimes the newer needles, definitely. The older ones, maybe not so much. Radiata pines, I find with those, they're one tree I'll have to be cutting the needles. Other ones I can pluck and it's no problem. I'm not doing any damage. So just it's up to you. Make an assessment based on your tree. But they're really the big tricks is make sure that your tweezers are pointing in the same direction as the needle when you come down and grab it and pull it out. Watch for needle your tweezers slipping on the needles, so you're squeezing them nice and firmly. And I find holding them like a pair of chopsticks rather than trying to grab them like in my fist. If I have them sitting on my hand like a pair of chopsticks, then that I find is really simple, easy, quick. It causes less cramping for me, but I find it's a really simple, easy, quick way to be plucking the needles, and it saves you having to think. There's so much going through your head when you're working on your trees, especially with your shaping, bud selection, cutbacks, bud conveyor, inner buds. If I can just have a dull moment for a second by plucking the needles and having them sit on my hand, and all I got to do is think, are my tweezers pointing the same direction? The needle's growing. Great. I'm plucking in the right direction. Then that's all I have to worry about. It's easy. All right. So to wrap it up, this section, the last part to talk about is needle density. I get asked a lot, and a lot of talk, and a lot of different approaches about. Okay, this time of the year, how many pairs of needles do you leave? It's controversial. It's like talking about soil mixes. When you talk about this with pine, I leave 5 pair, I leave 6 pair, I leave 10 pair, I leave 8 pair, or whatever. I don't count. I really don't. I work on the approach of needle density. And this is done by looking at the tree before you start. Just sit back before you get in there and you get white line fever and you're tearing into your tree and you're neck deep in it and you're plucking all these needles. Just have a look at the tree and think, okay, where's the weakest area on this tree? Okay, it's that lower branch. It's the intersection of that lower branch. Would I be okay if that branch died? Simple question. If that branch died, would the tree be okay? If the answer is no, well, that then guides you as to what needle density you've got to leave, because I'll guarantee you in that weaker area, there's far less resources being allocated, which means all those branches are a bit spindly. The needles will be a bit longer. They'll be a bit disheveled, a bit ugly, but there just won't be a lot of needle mass in there now. That area for me starts to dictate what I'm going to be doing with the rest of the tree. I'm trying to balance the rest of the tree. Needle allocation, needle density is a way that we get to dictate the allocation of resources. If there's no needles, there's good chance there's going to be no resources or minimal resources going to that area. If there's a lot of needles, there's going to be a lot of resources going to that area. So we get to quite easily dictate to our pines where we want the resources to go. Some trees you might find that needle length might be about the same depending on the species. Other trees, like a black pine, you might find it's really pushed long needles because it's stretching, it's reaching for the sun. I haven't obviously done enough work in that area. I haven't let enough light into that area. It's got too thick and dense above it, whether it's a temporary thing post-decandling or whether it's just something that's been a problem for a long time. Now's the time to take action on that. So sit back, work out roughly what sort of needle density you're going to need to make sure that low area gets the resources that it needs, and then start working in the stronger areas, so the apex of the tree, and plucking back accordingly. So you might look at that lower area, and if you're a needle counter, then you might look at it and go, okay, well, there's about 15 pair of needles in that lower area. All right, so the upper area, as a rough guide, I'm going to come back to 10 or 12 pair of needles, because I want that slightly, less resources there, and I want some more resources to get to that bottom one. And so you work your way down the tree, and then you sit back and look at it and go, okay, so if it's a really weak area, then when you look at the tree sitting back, you want to look at it and say, okay, I've deliberately left more needles in the weaker area so I can pull resources to that area. Make it stronger. I'll sort out the balancing act later on. If everything's about the same on the tree, then you'll look at it and go, well, I want the needle mass to be roughly the same. If the set of scales is out of balance, more needles in the weaker areas, less needles in the stronger areas. If it's all in balance and everything is looking okay, then the needle density should be the same all over the whole tree. And you've got to be able to see through the tree. You've got to be able to do the hand test. So when you finish your work, just have a look at it. Put your hand on, the other side of the apex. Can you see through it? Can you see your hand? If you shine a torch through it, is the torch light going to get through that tree? If it's not, then keep going. You have to keep working on it. Even though it may look magnificent being nice and thick and dense, you've got to scale it back so light and air can get into those inner areas. Otherwise, you know what? For about the 400th time in this episode of the podcast, the bud conveyor is going to start to fail. Once that bud conveyor starts to fail, what happens? All the growth stays on the periphery of those pads, starts to push out and gets longer and longer and longer. Then when we sit down with it next year and you listen to the podcast where I say, hey, if it's too long, too wide, you've got to cut back. You've got to force that growth back in closer to the trunk. If that bud conveyor has failed for whatever reason and you haven't got those inner buds, then how do you cut back? How do you keep the tree nice and compact? How do you keep that density of the foliage in nice and close to the tree? So right now it's really important when you are doing your needle plucking and you're thinning out in your bud selection that you're making sure that you're getting light and air into those inner sections of the tree, because that is the future. That is what we're going to look at next year, and hopefully the tree's going to take that big step forward where you can go, last year I only cut it back a little way, but next year it's going to be even better. And you come and sit back, look at the tree and go, yeah, I made the first cut, but now I've got all this stuff in closer. Now I'm back at compaction point. It might be a 2-year cycle that you have to get through, 2 different seasons of autumn, winter cleaning and cutbacks before you can achieve your goal, but you'll achieve it. That's the best part, by making sure that when you are needle plucking that you're thinning out as correctly as what you possibly can. There's always so much to talk about with bonsai. when I first thought about doing Bonsai Stuff podcast on a weekly basis, I thought, I'll run out. Surely it's got to be like a tank of petrol where I'll get to the point where it's over and done. But for me, the focus on the here and now, the benefit that people that listen to the podcast get by these prompts, like I'm sure I've talked about cutting back your pines. I'm sure I've talked about needle plucking over the last 8 seasons, but it's nice to refresh it. I come across something in the workshop. I have a tree in front of me. There's always something there that I can use to make sure that there's bonsai stuff that we can talk about, that we can, there can be benefit passed down the line, and it doesn't. I know that the topic, the episode talks about styling your practical advice for styling your pine, but it applies to all your trees. A lot of things, it's whether it's leaves or needles or scale foliage, whatever it is. The concept for me about foliage mass density, about extension, about cutting back, about the ski jump effect, it applies to almost every single one of my trees. I use one standard soil mix for all my trees. I fertilise, give or take for the phosphate sensitive ones, I fertilise the same way with all my trees. I manage them. I look after them for all the other issues, the pest, fungal, whatever. They all get cared for the same way. So even though they're different varieties and we can lump them all into massive big baskets and say conifers or deciduous or Australian natives or whatever it is, I put them all into one bigger basket and just call them bonsai, because they're not special. They're not different. They're not unique. They've all got fine detail that we can amend and we can vary and we can change. But as far as the way that you work with them, as far as letting light and air into those inner areas, as far as wiring, your skills, your technical side of things, as far as how you use your scissors to remove foliage, it's not different. It's the same for all of them. So hopefully this podcast helped on multiple levels, and it's sort of, I like it that it can sort of bring together ideas and things that maybe you've been thinking about or looking at your trees going, it's getting too big. How do I manage this? How do I push this back? I know Scott will let me know on his weekly podcast. Anyway, thanks for listening in. Thanks, as always, to the subscribers. I love you, and I do love a shout out to you. And thank you for the messages that have been coming through thick and fast from all around the world. It's a beautiful time in bonsai for me. I'm absolutely loving it. So thank you very much for keeping the smile on my dial. As always, I'll be back next week and give your trees a cuddle for me. Make sure that you do check them out. I haven't talked about pests and all that sort of stuff, and getting later in towards the winter period and overwatering. I've done enough of that. So this was more of a styling type podcast. But next week I'll be back again with some more bonsai stuff for you. Until then, as always, happy bonsai.